All right, so welcome in, and next we're going to cover the major philosophical issues in psychology. In other words, these are some of the major debates that are happening in the field from a classical sense, but also to present day. So we're going to look at three key philosophical debates that still exist. First one we're going to talk about is very classic. It is called free will versus determinism. So in essence, what this is asking in terms of human behavior, is our behavior governed by free will or is it determined? The folks who subscribe to determinism basically feel that all behavior has a cause. In other words, behavior is triggered by something, it is caused by something, almost as if it's predetermined in our destiny. Free will, on the other hand, is implying that as humans, we have the ability to make independent decisions. So in other words, we actively can decide whether or not to do something, where determinism is kind of saying it's predetermined and will be caused by something. Let me give you an example. So if we have someone who chooses to be violent, for example, if you're under the determinism sort of realm, we would say that that violent behavior is ultimately caused by something and it was predetermined, whether it was some kind of pre-existing condition or the laws of the universe or whatever you want, however you want to explain it. It's basically saying that behavior has been caused by something. The person did not choose to do that. Whereas free will is saying that our behavior is caused by a person's independent decision. So at some point when that person was violent, they actually decided to do so. They could have said no, they could have said yes. In this particular case, we're saying they decided to do that. So in other words, it's really kind of reflecting the debate about, as humans, do we have this ability to decide things, or is our destiny predetermined? Our next major debate is known as the mind-brain problem. And so what the mind-brain problem, it's a philosophical question of how our conscious experience is related to the actual brain. So on one side of the fence, we have the dualists. Dual meaning two, so that should be easy to remember. What these folks are proposing is that the mind, once again, by mind we mean conscious experience, is separate from the actual brain, meaning the tissue inside your skull. In other words, these are dual existing components, or if you will, separate entities that somehow influence each other. So even though there's that connection, ultimately they are separate things. Well, our author of the book disagrees with this because he believes it contradicts the law of conservation, which is a basic principle of science. So if you know your science, the only way to influence matter or energy is to act on it with other matter or energy. So the point is that the mind, safely you could say that that is not something that's tangible in terms of consciousness. You can't hold it in your hand, for example. So in other words, by the laws of science and what we know and the evidence that we have, they're saying that it's possibly impossible for something that's physical, like the actual brain, to influence something that's not, and vice versa. In other words, we simply don't have the evidence to support that. Maybe someday that will be proven, but at this point we don't have that according to our author, so he's saying it's basically impossible. So our author, and as well as many of our modern neuroscientists, follow what we call monism. Monism, once again, meaning one. There's an easy way to remember that. It's the view that consciousness, i.e. the mind, is inseparable from the physical brain. So in other words, Either they're the same thing or they're part of the same system. They're inseparable. So in an analogy to kind of explain this one, the way I kind of think of it is the brain is like our computer, okay? And consciousness, what we're feeling, what we're experiencing at any given time, is the software that the brain actually runs. So in other words, consciousness is going to stem from the brain. Even though they're kind of separate things, they are part of the same system or process. So I'm going to next show you some evidence that our author presents. So as you're looking at the screen here, and these are actually images of a brain scan, more specifically something called positron emission tomography, which is listed in Chapter 3. Most people know it as a PET scan. And in this particular example, our subjects are experiencing something through their senses, or they're doing some type of task, in other words, consciousness, and the psychologists have analyzed their brain at the same time. The way this works is we would inject each subject with a chemical into their bloodstream, and that chemical serves as a tracer. This tracer is then detected by the computer. So what you're seeing here are different levels of the chemical represented as the colors, or another way you could think of it, differences in blood flow. So if you look over here to this image which says visual, this particular subject is looking at some picture or something that's visual, and you'll notice that this part of the brain shows activity. In other words, the red and yellow indicate lots of blood flow, lots of that chemical that we've injected into them, and therefore more activity. So in other words, what they're saying is that when you look at something, there's a simultaneous change in the brain that occurs, which shows that activity. It shows that that's where we're processing visual information. Okay, so this makes complete sense to me because this back portion of the brain is actually the occipital lobe. It's known as the occipital lobe, and that is where we process visual information. So in other words, in every subject that they've studied, they've noticed that when they look at something, this part of the brain becomes active, and thus there's a huge connection or correlation between those two things. So the argument against dualist is that if these things are truly separate, consciousness and the brain, why do we see this connection? Why is there a consistent association between our conscious experiences and these different parts of the brain? So if you look at the image here, you'll see all the different examples of that, and those red colors once again are corresponding to enhanced activity of brain areas we know are associated with those different types of abilities or tasks. Finally, we're going to cover something called nature versus nurture. Wow, this is a classic one. This one has been debated for decades. And essentially, nature is kind of like what you're born with, and nurture is more your environment, what you learned later after birth. An easy way to think of it is genetics versus environment as an example. In other words, when it comes to human behavior, is the behavior that we're showing due to our nature? In other words, we were born naturally this way to show this behavior, or is it something that we learned later on through our environment, such as our upbringing by our parents, our cultural influences, maybe television that we've seen, those kind of things. So in other words, when we look at behavior, is it something that we're sort of born with through the laws of biology, or is it something that we're exposed to and learn later on? So let me give you an example. I want you to imagine that I'm a school counselor at an elementary school, and a teacher refers a young student to me, little Johnny. Little Johnny is an extremely violent child. He beats up other kids. He physically threatens his teacher. He is just a tough, mean person. So in other words, when we're examining his behavior, and where possibly this aggression stems from. If I'm on the nature side of the fence, I would say something like, maybe he inherited a gene for aggression, and that's why he's so aggressive. So at conception, he inherited this gene from his parents, and that explains why he's a violent child. It's been with him from day one. On the other side of the coin, we have our nurture folks, and this is implying that it was learned after birth, or some kind of environmental variable that little Johnny was exposed to. I guess you could argue prenatally as well, that may have encouraged that violent behavior. So for example, if we look at Johnny's home life, we notice that mom and dad are very physically abusive to each other. Maybe Johnny watches a lot of violent movies and violent video games, which could have instilled those types of behaviors. Or even he grew up in a really rough neighborhood where there was violence present. The point is that as a result of being exposed to that, that may have catered to those aggressive tendencies. So now I know you're wondering which one is correct, right? And remember, for all three of these, I want you to make up your own mind. I'm not going to try to brainwash you. Please think of these from your own viewpoint, if you agree or disagree or whatever. However, what the research is showing for this last one is that we know that both of those are probably important in terms of the nature-nurture stuff. In fact, our safe answer is it's 50-50. Many studies for a variety of psychological disorders, for example, show the importance of both of these in influencing those different types of behaviors. And not only that, they probably interact with each other. For example, you may have been born with a genetic predisposition, such as a phobia, and then something happened to you, and that's where the phobia basically was turned on, so to speak. So maybe the child went through some type of trauma, and from that point on, the phobia began. So whatever way you look at it, it seems that both of those, nature and nurture, seem to be very important, and we probably should be looking at both of those as we're examining people. This concludes the philosophical debate audiovisual lecture. Please listen to the next lecture in the series.